Hey everyone, it's Naomi Wolf here, and I'm really honored and thrilled to have DailyClout's Poet Laureate, Stephen Matthews, with us once again. Welcome, Stephen.
Hello, Naomi. It's great to be here again.
We're really glad to have you. So Stephen Matthews, people say poetry is not something that is an active part of the lives of readers these days and citizens, and we found that that's really not true. Stephen Matthews is our kind of stealth pop star on DailyClout. His videos explaining poetry, his poetry, and really the mission of poetry in general to everyone, not keeping it within the ivory tower or behind closed doors, have been consistently our most popular videos on DailyClout. So we're thrilled to have the Mick Jagger of poetry back with us. And
not quite as old as Mick, thank God, yet. But anyway, I'm getting there.
But your following is as passionate. And we're actually filming from Oxford. Stephen lives in Oxford and teaches in various places, and he'll tell you more about that, but it's a beautiful kind of rainy day in Oxford. We're here in a bed and breakfast, very kind of appropriate for the setting of greeting a British poet, and a reading kind of place and a reading kind of day. And we're going to talk today with Stephen about work he's done recently that addresses the climate crisis and how poets and poetry can help us grapple with the big crises of our time. So Stephen, over to you. What is it you wanted to share with us this morning?
Well, one of the things that has been very much in my mind during the recent events and the protests across the world is, of course, that poetry was very much there at the start of thinking about our relationship to the natural world and our relationship to the things that are happening there, and the way that our kind of responses to the natural world have always been essential to us and right at the heart of what we do. So if you go right back through the centuries to ancient Greece, for instance, people are lamenting the loss of their loved ones by situating their poems in the natural world and writing about a kind of pastoral form that is very much projecting through nature, but also responding to nature.
Can you explain to everyone what pastoral means?
Pastoral means a kind of writing that's set out in the countryside. It's quite idealized. It's not always kind of tuned into the absolute natural event, but on the other hand, it's interesting that we feel that we need to go back to the countryside, back to the landscape, when the most important things are going on inside us and inside our minds. So we've got centuries and centuries worth of poetry that's actually thinking about landscape, thinking about our relationship to the natural world. And we need to kind of draw upon that, I think, at this moment, and think about how new poems might be created and used to refocus us at this time of climate emergency.
Beautifully put. And just to chime in, you were recently honored, as they should have honored you, at the Oxford University Museum of Natural History that gave you a special platform. Do you want to tell us about that?
Well, this was a fantastic kind of moment when I was able to spend a year with a couple of other poets, John Barney and Kelly Swain, in the Natural History Museum. And what we were asked to do was simply to enjoy the space, enjoy the place, speak with the scientists who are working on the different collections there, and create new poetry out of that experience. But of course, this was at a moment really when climate emergency was starting to be very much a part of people's consciousness. And what I was very aware of across that time was not just that the museum, as it were, celebrates natural history and natural life on our planet, but also laments the fact that that natural history is a very fragile and precarious possibility moving into the future. So I was very aware that I was both kind of tuning into history, but also that history itself was about to break perhaps and change desperately for us, and that we need to take responsibility for that, and that we need to kind of create a poetry that is also perhaps more optimistic around that experience, thinking about how we might adjust ourselves, as I say, but also celebrate the things that are out there before they disappear, and think about new possibilities within us.
I mean, that's, again, very eloquent, but how should I not kill myself at this point? I mean, you seem to be saying, let's deal with the emergency by hymning, the nightingale before it vanishes forever. That's not exactly what you're saying, right?
Well, I'm saying that one of the things that becomes clear when we go to these museums, and particularly when we have the privilege that I had of going behind the scenes and seeing the massive collections, is that we're aware that nature actually does not care that much about us. That our situation in the world is probably a kind of temporary one, but there's a huge abundance and a huge possibility within nature to make itself anew all the time. It's us who are kind of wrecking it at the moment, but on the other hand, nature, as I say, kind of laughs at our stupidity in thinking that we can absolutely control it. Nature can take its revenge upon us, as we'll see in some of the poems, but also nature has this possibility simply of kind of going to ground and re-evolving into something very different that might actually exclude us entirely.
So, I mean, that is very humbling and really a wake-up call that we see this whole crisis as oriented around ourselves. But the natural world will be fine, will regenerate, will continue in some other iteration after we have extinguished ourselves through our insanity.
Well, it seems to have done it at least 4 or 5 times in the past. It's faced apocalypse, faced complete wipeout, and then restarted and regenerated itself. So we are foolish to think that we somehow, through our rationality and through our superb inventions, can somehow harness this force, which is actually always beyond us, and much of it we don't understand, of course.
You are really striking an important note, because one thing that's very humbling to me, and I think humility is what we need in order to get out of this crisis, is when you go to the Museum of Natural History, you're really struck by how every era, at least for the last 200 years, thought they knew what the hell was going on and thought they had explanatory models for the world around them, and that turned out to have been completely bogus. So, and plus they're always like killing off the dodo, right? The last stuffed dodo, I believe.
Which I saw the dodo in the Natural History Museum. Yes, anyway,
right? Yeah. And so you see like Darwin arising and beginning to figure things out, but before Darwin there were people who were sure that the existing world was 4,000 years old.
Exactly.
Biblical number. And so I think that that's really a useful thing for us to bear in mind, and people should run out and buy or order Stephen Matthews' Guests of Time, which is poetry from the Oxford University Museum of Natural History, if you can't physically get to the museum, because it's a way to touch the fact that these, we've been wrong so many times before, and so, really a deep humility and turning to the poets, not just the scientists, is really critical. Having said that, please share a poem with us.
Well, in terms of the thinking about that whole history, I wrote a poem at the museum that is very much kind of based upon that idea, which is that particularly in the 19th century, everybody thought that nature was going to continually expand and become more powerful, and this was the kind of inevitability. So there's a huge kind of optimism around at that point in time, which obviously now we are more skeptical about. So what I did is to think about some of the things in and around the museum, and to think about how those things are themselves kind of transitory and fragile, and that we should not presume in any sense, I like your word humble, we should not presume in any sense that we can make this kind of continue. So this is a poem that is, as I say, taking particular kind of objects, particular aspects of the natural world, able to reproduce themselves, but that they will continually expand, which of course has become a farce for us now.
And who wrote that poem?
And that was a poem by Thomas Warner called Emblems. Okay. A couple of things to mention here. It references an earlier nature poet, Ted Hughes, who celebrated the fish in Britain's rivers, the salmon and the pike, but of course they're under threat. And it talks about Cleopatra butterflies. So we're thinking, as I say, about what is beautiful in the natural world, but also what we need to kind of pay respect to and how we need to alter our attitude towards it. Yet if time cycles, forests swell. If we kept in our minds fishes' fins could be wings, raising all up into a chemical soup sky, or that a dull granite boulder could shift with ice 100 miles from Shap to Filey just like that. Or if we imagined waking into beeless silences in springtimes, worried what we would eat. If only we'd foreseen that pesticides might flow from fields and suffocate Hughes's salmon and pike, or known that racipine from shrubs reduces stress and its rainforest homes are already half gone. If we'd seen razorbills surfboarding on branches to behead frogs downstream, or Cleopatra flexing yellow wingtips and raising itself up to blue Bambarian skies like a coloured flickbook, or we'd understood that whatever in a day comes into being dies from the world that same day, maybe we'd change our thoughts, maybe we would think.
What is it about great poetry that literally gives people chills? That is so powerful and beautiful and musical and terrifying.
Well, it's lovely that you say musical. It's recently been set by a British composer called Gerald Francis Hode for string quartet and soprano voice, and it was premiered a few weeks ago. So I'm really moved that you found something musical about that. But
oh, you can hear it. Like, can you explain to? I mean, I hate to even talk after such a magnificent poem. So distressing, also. like that does more than. Like I read the report from the IPCC on climate change during the, as a kind of production during the Edinburgh Festival with a group called 1.5 Degrees. And that was wonderful, but it's kind of academic, scientific, scholarly prose, and it doesn't move you to just a few sentences of a poem like yours that's saying, imagine forward just a little bit, like to no bees in the summer, worrying what we're going to eat, these things we've just discovered save our lives and half of it is gone.
Exactly. Yeah.
Just a few phrases make the human mind evolve faster than any amount of scientific verbiage. So I think everyone in the world should read Yet with Time's Cycles, Forest Swells. Why did you skip that verse?
That verse is very much based in the museum. It was celebrating the museum space.
Read the verse. Everyone needs the whole poem. Do you mind? Read the verse.
Read that one verse.
Yes,
okay. You need to bear in mind that the Natural History Museum in Oxford was set up as a kind of cathedral to the beauties of the natural world. That is what it looks like.
Fantastic.
So it's a kind of 19th century creation with this beautiful inner court with the light coming through it. But what I wanted to do in the poem is to think about the ways in which the museum holds incredibly ancient things. So this verse that I skipped out mentions the fact that somebody had created ink out of dinosaur bones and had drawn pictures with it, but it also celebrates that light. So the verse runs, if only we'd conceived of a fossil sepia sketch of a dinosaur in ink as old as it, or if everywhere raised cathedrals of light and scope uplifting life, showing us what life is.
I see. Why did they create ink out of dinosaur bones? It's just one of those Victorian things.
I think it was something about, being interested in the ancient past and thinking about the ancient past in ways that can be literally rewritten into the present in a kind of very
literal way.
Absolute way, but I think also then creating a kind of cathedral that is full of kind of light and life is a further kind of recreation, reincarnation of those kind of ancient possibilities, as you could see there all of dinosaurs standing around.
Literally, what can you show the viewers that picture again? So what this is like a cathedral, like a Victorian cathedral, but it's got dinosaur bones, right? Fossils in the center of it.
Yes. And the idea is that the museum is preserved as it was in its kind of Victorian state in an odd sense. So all the cases and everything are from that kind of period. So bizarrely, the museum itself is becoming kind of fossilized in some sense.
But let me, before you go on, just speak to that kind of heritage. in the Natural History Museum and in similar museums that were founded, I'm thinking of the Natural History Museum in New York, in this great period after Darwin and kind of before 1920 of classification, right? It was all about like categories and phyla and cases and pinning things down, right? And I'm going somewhere with this. And Stephen also talked about this Victorian belief, or this great sense of forward motion. Progress was inevitable. Things were going to get better and better. More and more diseases would be cured. Human beings would figure out kind of better and better methods of government. People would become more and more literate. Technology would solve everything. That worldview, I mean, the Victorians are amazing. And we owe them a lot. But that worldview of everything can be pinned down and things are getting better and better and technology is the answer, that really is our curse as well, right?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, paradoxically, of course, it's the Victorians who are largely responsible for the kinds of technology and revolution which is now blighting the planet, and which we can't really expunge yet from where we are.
Exactly. I mean, even the models we have of measuring what a good outcome is descend from the Victorians, and really, like this cathedral that was built. It's such a great metaphor, and the dinosaurs and the kind of scientific exhibits are in the cathedral because the Victorians had a crisis of faith, and they realized there was a lot of research on kind of the historical Jesus, and people were, rejecting the literal interpretation of the Bible and losing their faith, right? And so science kind of took over in the heart of the cathedral, which is why we need all the more to bring back the poets like Stephen and the mystics and the visionaries who understand the scientific project, but are not believing that that's all there is to the world or to the human mission. So with that.
I think just trying to readjust ourselves. I mean, when I was making this poem, I was very much aware of that kind of sense that we're trapped in the continuity, but the continuity is something that's deluding us as well. So the poem itself is one sentence. It moves through all of those kind of images and those different perspectives until we get right to the end, which is where it breaks. Maybe we change our thoughts, full stop. Maybe we would think. So it offers a kind of challenge to that idea of kind of progress and the sense that we need to jump off and reappraise everything that we do. Really.
Change our thoughts. That's the part that gave me chills. Maybe you don't just mean change what we think or change our thinking. You mean literally change our thoughts.
Exactly. Yes. Listen to our thoughts in more appropriate and better ways and truer ways to ourselves.
Which is literally what our survival requires right now.
Well, as I said, poetry has always known that the natural world is where we should be, and that we are creatures, we are animals. It's about our kind of creatureliness primarily, I think, and one of the things that it does, it gives a kind of body to our thoughts in a very different kind of way. As you say, our reports on climate change are absolutely essential, but they don't embody everything for us.
Let's have another. This is addictive.
Well, another poem that I've been working on in relation to the immediate kind of Extinction Rebellion moment is to think about this particular species that are disappearing, that are under threat, and how they might be adapting and changing themselves in response to the sort of crisis that we have created for them. So I looked at a list of species that are particularly fading from our view at the moment, and some of them I do remember from my own childhood, as I'm sure you do. So this is a little poem about a red mason bee, and I remember mason bees setting up in part of the house where I was brought up, and you could see them coming and going. These bees essentially make their homes in mortar between bricks. They make their homes, as we'll see, in snail shells. They make their homes wherever they can. They're really interesting, I think, at this particular kind of moment, because red mason bees are largely female. They have very little kind of to do with males, and therefore whatever wonders they achieve and whatever beauty they kind of create in the world is very much a kind of female thing rather than a male thing. And I do think that there's something about that kind of model of progress that you are saying is so troublesome to us, that is primarily male, if we look back through the centuries. So this is a little poem that is attempting to think about how the future might be created out of the present, hopefully, but also drawing upon some facets of red mason bees that show us something about the delight in nature. I think that we should all enjoy and celebrate. Red mason bee. A skillful artist, her fine ginger hairs were her deft paintbrush, ever yellowing as she danced the air, dabbing pollen grains, pink blossom to pink blossom, tree to tree. The fingernail sheen inside nail shells glowed as she layered rose petals for her nests, then laid an egg there, bunged each shelter hole with chewed clots of soil, all to incubate.
So beautiful.
Well, it's not me who's doing the beautiful things, it's the red mason bees. I mean, once you start reading about the fact that they use flower petals to line their nests, that's an incredible.
I mean, that is incredible. That's like nature making metaphors for poets.
Exactly. Exactly, yes. So once you start to realize that even snail shells that are simply kind of lying around, the snail has died, they become new homes and new kind of repositories for this future new life that is literally incubating through the winter. So there's a kind of subdued sense that, you know, the seasonal cycle, if you like, might actually offer us a kind of optimism moving into the future.
But you are very modest and you say it is not you who is making the beauty. But listen, I'm just going to reread the second verse. Listen to what Stephen's doing with sound and with music. The fingernail sheen inside snail shells glowed as she layered rose petals for her nests, then laid an egg there, bunged each shelter hole with chewed clots of soil, all to incubate. Like, as you're reading, your inner ear is responding to this incredibly sophisticated use of sound. And, you know, married to meaning, the first half, you've got these internal echoes like fingernail and snail. And you've got this kind of visual of, you know, beautiful rose petals and sheen and glow. And then the second half is like, you can almost hear the sound of the dirt being kind of crunched and layered, shelter hole, chewed clots of soil. And then it ends, you know, he brings it together, which I love. You always do this kind of in this kind of quiet, like completeness, all to incubate. It's all about the rebirth in the future. And so you're going on an auditory journey and not just a journey of abstract meaning.
Well, I hope so. I think that that musical aspect of poetry is something that always fascinates me, and I think that it's something that actually we depend upon more than words quite often. So that well, I think there's recent research that suggests that music, as it were, speaks to those parts of the brain much more immediately and centrally than language does. And actually that we perhaps hear the sound of words before we make the meaning out of them. I know we're talking fractions of milliseconds, but it's the shape of the sounds that actually gives us the clue to what the word is saying. So I think this kind of aspect of poetry that can be musical is absolutely kind of vital to all of us.
Is that why poetry makes us feel things that prose doesn't?
I think that there's a lot of evidence emerging now to suggest that those kind of centers of our emotional being depend very much upon the sound world around us, and that we're unconsciously listening in and tuning in, literally tuning ourselves to that world as much as we can day to day. But the problem is, of course, that our world is so noisy and so discordant and disharmonious in every sense. Our politics, our attitude towards each other is very much about kind of cutting ourselves off so frequently, so that we don't spend time listening to what it is that we share and what we need to keep in common between us. So I think poetry is absolutely the way that we must do that.
Yeah. You're making me think a lot of things at once, and one of them is about how many pre-printing cultures, and and I've seen this when I've traveled in places where people still gather as a village and tell stories or dance together or play music together.
Yes.
I'm thinking, where do we in the West or in the global North still come together and harmonize, right? And the only place we do it anymore is in temple or in at a mosque or in church, you know, when we're singing a hymn or chanting a prayer. But in the 19th century, people used to read poetry aloud. Maybe they didn't read it all together, but they sat together and listened to poetry read aloud. And I can imagine that actually harmonizes or tunes human relationships as well.
Well, if you think of the scene around the family hearth in the evening, for instance, we've completely lost that, haven't we? But it's only going back to our parents' generation when the family would gather together. There was not much heat in the rooms. They would come together around the fire, and yes, somebody would read something out, even if it was only the newspaper. But we've lost that sense of a kind of communal space for language. A lot of the way that we consume language now is through Twitter or Facebook, which is simply a private activity, after all, paradoxically, given that it's meant to open us out to the world, but we're experiencing these words in our own private space, in our own heads, even if we're sitting in a communal space whilst we're glancing at our phones. That seems to me to be deeply tragic, actually.
It is deeply tragic, which is why we bring you here. You know, it seems paradoxical because DailyClout is a platform devoted to democracy, but what is more important to democracy than people being in relationship with each other? And maybe you've answered this mysterious question about maybe if we listen to poetry together, listen to music together, create poetry and music together, we, you know, our brains will like actually attune in a way that they might not if we were just listening to someone read a scientific paper.
Well, paradoxically, I'm so grateful that you've enabled me to talk in this way about it. But I really do agree. I think that actually some of these more ancient forms, supposedly, and some of these more unpopular forms, everybody now thinks that poetry is difficult and that it can't somehow speak directly. But I hope that it's possible to write poems that do speak to everyone, and that they can be shared.
That's why I love your work so much, and why I'm always trying to, you know, do all I can to in spite of my challenges with technology, to get you on this platform, because we talked last time about how you come from a not like born with a silver spoon in your mouth kind of background. If you don't mind my bringing this up, I think a lot of people will be glad to relate to this. Like, you sound very posh, and you know, you're a British white man, but you know, can people relate to your background?
I think to British people, I maybe don't sound particularly posh. I think people sometimes have difficulties understanding what I'm talking about. I come from Essex. People say that Essex people kind of mutter to each other rather than speak aloud to each other. So.
My husband says he wants to record your voice to help him fall asleep every night. I mean, he means that in a very complimentary way, that it's so relaxing.
Yes, well, I think people have negative responses as well to that kind of feeling. So, yes, well, I think it helps with thinking about audience, doesn't it? I think it helps that even with a kind of complex poem, and I think this Red Mason Bee poem, as you're pointing out, is actually quite complex. It's thinking about different layers of sound. It's thinking about different layers. You know, it's a past tense poem. It's talking about the way that the mason bee used to do this, but on the other hand, it's trying to open out to the future. These things are difficult to kind of pick up on one hearing, but I think that the way that I try to use sound is precisely to, as you're suggesting, open up poetry to those people who are not privileged in any sense, who are not kind of born to necessarily expect that there will be, you know, a library with poetry books in it. I didn't have that when I was growing up.
Well, thank you. I meant to bring that up again for those who missed that conversation the last time. You talked about your grandmother, I believe, reading poems in the paper, and that she was a working person, as I recall.
She was, as all her sisters were. She left school at age 12, and she was put to work in a big country house, in service, as they used to call it. All of my female relatives of that generation were brought up in service.
Which means domestic work.
Which means domestic work, which means scrubbing, cleaning, not even being allowed to do any cooking. And that was how they were brought up through their teens, really, until beyond the point they got married. Then my grandmother worked as a waitress in a restaurant for the rest of her working life. So these are people who really were going around helping the rich, dusting the books in the library, but not feeling that they had access to those books.
But poetry was so important to her.
Poetry was so important to you.
And I do think that's why one reason your voice is so pure and effective is that I really think you write for everyone, you know. And that is a higher discipline, I think, than writing in jargon. Can you give us one more while we've got you, please?
Yes, I can give you one more. Maybe literally to think about the fact that through history, poetry has known about the current climate situation. This is a slightly longer poem, is that okay?
Please.
If we just finish with this. So the Greek god Orpheus, of course, was the god of poetry, and this is a poem about whether poetry can survive the kind of clatter and dreadful kind of sounds and the apocalypse that we are currently going through. Okay, so this is thinking about whether poetry can survive, and it's called The Dying of Orpheus, but it's actually made up of snippets, translations from the Roman poet Ovid. So Ovid already knew a lot of this, and this is an attempt to remake Ovid's understanding for us today. The Dying of Orpheus. The unnatural voices, clamour, the riot, the mother of all bomb shatterings, the self-slapping and furies of the afflicted, the caterwaul as birds of day rip at birds of night who have wandered out of time, the tearing jet engines, motorbikes, the constant drilling and mining and sirens, bawl against natural consonants, stutter persistent rhythm, cannot give it ear, so that everything gets translated to extremes. Algae darken the ice caps, absorb light, meltwaters and oceans heighten, too much sun, then violent rains perish and corrupt the crops, rampant darnels and thistles exhaust the land, water, which should be shared by all, is stolen for some, good air, power, gas, light, given for the life of all, is captured for the few, the nursing mother is parched till her pharynx no longer wheezes into voice. The sun sets the world in all parts ablaze, a vast furnace, bushfires, forest fires, prairie fires, wildfires, flaring air unbreathable, seas and lakes contract, dust and sand accumulate, lake bottoms fissured as deep as hell are screened round the world. Reservoirs drain, Italy's olives and grapes desiccate on the bough, till thunderheads gather again, bolts are thrown, low fronts and winds unleashed, until all is sea and tsunamis. Wolves, dolphins, sheep swim among highest tree branches. Cars and advertising boards swept along by river race and overflow. Beneath all a desire, forefends, noise, news, tragedy, the singing travels, ground-based threnody constant at the edge of hearing. So I've added very little there. Actually, when the poem is printed, there are a few bracketed phrases that, but they are the only modern parts of the poem. The rest of it is literally a translation from Ovid.
Really?
Who has the image of the nursing mother who is parched, who has the idea of the lake bottoms, who has the idea that nature is turning against itself, the birds are ripping each other apart in their quest for food, who has the sense that the land is becoming exhausted. So all of that was known to Roman poets. Right. We have simply added our own dire and dastardly variations to it.
If I may, if that doesn't stop us, nothing will. I mean, that, again, that kind of physical, like, wave of, I've heard the voice of the prophet and we are in big trouble.
Yes.
what Stephen has done is put the modern terms in parentheses here: power, gas, light, the tearing jet engines, motorbikes, and they like are eruptions in this classical translation from Ovid, a great Roman poet who foresaw, like as anyone did who lived on the earth, like what catastrophic earth rebelling against us looks like. I mean, it's not a new idea, right? I mean, the Hebrew Bible, classical antiquity, they knew that the gods could get furious and blight the land.
Yes,
right?
yes. Well, absolutely. All of this kind of natural disaster is caused by the gods in Ovid, who become angry with humankind. And I think maybe that in that is a message for us as well, that these forces that have been unleashed are due to human error and human fault and human presumption primarily.
We do need to regain that sense of we can't take it for granted that the Romans and the Hebrews and the Native Americans and pretty much everyone else except for us has had.
Exactly, yes.
What was it in Ovid here that made the gods so angry? What had people been doing? Do you recall?
Well, typically, of course, it was about the fact that the humans fell out of love with them or refused to love them, that the gods loved human beauty, as we know, that they celebrated humanity, both male and female, that they felt that they themselves, the gods, wanted to create new possibilities with and through humanity. Often that was horrifying. Of course, it was through the rape of women largely, but when their lust, their desire was rejected by humanity, what did the gods do? They unleashed natural disaster upon the world, and humanity is literally kind of swept away. But the natural order of things is scrambled horribly, so that you get some scenes that we've seen quite recently, haven't we, where animals are swimming around in treetops here. Wolves, dolphins, sheep swim amongst highest tree branches. That's an image out of Ovid, but that's familiar to us from our TV screens pretty much every month.
And just so you know, if you're not in the United Kingdom, we get very censored international news in the United States, and we're not seeing much of these images of inundations and floods in Britain. We're really not exposed to it, and Britain is underwater in many.
Yes, it is. Yes. As are parts of India, the Far East, Japan recently had massive kind of flooding. People died. So these events are quite commonplace now across the globe, and it is causing dire problems, not just for animals, of course, but for humans. Particularly poorer humans who are put out of their homes by it.
And so at the very end, the singing travels, ground-based threnody, constant at the edge of hearing. Is that our doom or our redemption? Not to put you on the spot.
Well, I hope it's our redemption. I think that it's about this idea of listening again, isn't it? And that there is a constancy through things. There is a kind of continuing song that we can push ourselves towards, and that all the noise and all the clatter that so distracts us is actually kind of leading us astray. I mean, there's, again, new research, isn't there, saying that our brains are actually kind of being altered by the new technologies in ways we're conducting a massive experiment upon ourselves. But what I want to celebrate through poetry is the fact that always at the edge of our hearing, there are new wonders and new beautiful things that we need to celebrate and enjoy and recreate for ourselves.
And maybe that's a perfect note to end on for now, because maybe the takeaway, well, for me, the takeaway, Stephen, I always feel so refreshed and renewed when I talk to you and listen to you and listen to your poetry. And I do think there is something as beautiful as they are on the page. I think it's even more of a privilege, honestly, to hear a poet like you, read them orally and present them the way poetry used to be presented until recently by the poet to the community verbally. And maybe the takeaway is to put down the technology. And I mean, I've seen people start to experiment with, and I'm doing it myself, kind of just doing the vacation mode on their email most of the time, and really kind of not turning to one another, turning to the poets, turning to the animals, turning outside the window to the natural world. Maybe poets like you can still recall us before it's too late to the singing, the ground-based serenity, constant at the edge of hearing that could, in fact, save us.
Well, thank you very much, Naomi. I've really appreciated this and enjoyed it very much. It's been wonderful. Thank you.
I'm so glad. It's another sensational, I mean, you know, again, these runaway cult viewings of Stephen Matthews. It gives me hope. You know, it's not cat videos that are our most popular. It's this great poet reading his great poetry. And so we're going to say goodbye for now. Thank you so much for joining us. Our DailyClout Poet Laureate, Stephen Matthews, the books which you have to run out and get on Amazon, our guests of time, or at your local independent bookseller who can order them if they don't have them, or have them right there. Poetry from the Oxford University Museum of Natural History, and the other books are
On Magnetism.
On Magnetism, which is, I'm just dismantling this to show you because I want you to see the actual covers.
So this is On Magnetism.
And this is Skying.
And this is Skying.
So run out and get those. It's Naomi Wolf from DailyClout and Stephen Matthews, our Poet Laureate. And have a wonderful rest of your day.